Now this is a truly imposing structure, and the bridge runs a full 1.3 kilometers over the Chenab River. And just to give you a sense of how high it is, take a look down there.
What if I told you there's a railway so dangerous it claimed more than 100,000 lives just to be built? This isn't just history. It's a chilling tale of suffering, survival, and sacrifice. Known as the infamous Death Railway,
Trains in India will begin travelling on the world's highest single-arch railway bridge. It's part of a crucial rail connectivity project that connects Indian-administered Kashmir with the rest of the country for the first time by rail. Nikhil Ananda reports.
every mile of track laid was paid for in blood, sweat, and countless lives. Step into the haunting story behind this deadly construction, where human endurance was pushed to its very limits. The birth of a nightmare. It's 1942, and World War II is tearing the world apart. The Japanese Empire has just pulled off one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history, sweeping across Southeast Asia like wildfire. But there's one massive problem. They need to move troops and supplies between Thailand and Burma, and the sea routes are becoming too dangerous. So what did they do? They decided to build a railway through some of the most hostile jungle terrain on Earth. This was about to become the most brutal and deadly railway construction in human history. The Japanese military commanders had a simple but chilling plan. Use forced labor. More than 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and tens of thousands of forced laborers would perish during its construction. They didn't care about human lives. They only cared about completing this railway as fast as possible. The Burma-Thailand Railway, as it was officially known, would stretch for 415 kilometers through dense jungle, over treacherous mountains and across raging rivers. But the world would come to know it by a much more sinister name, the Death Railway. The Japanese needed a secure supply line to support their military operations in Burma. The existing sea routes were under constant attack from Allied forces, making them unreliable for moving the massive amounts of equipment and troops needed for their campaign. What makes this story even more horrifying is that the Japanese knew exactly what they were getting into. They understood the terrain was brutal, the conditions were deadly and impossible, but they pressed forward anyway, using human beings as expendable resources. The planning for this nightmare began in late 1941, just months after Pearl Harbor. Japanese engineers surveyed the route and quickly realized the enormous challenges ahead. Dense tropical forests, malaria-infested swamps, towering mountain ranges, and unpredictable monsoon seasons would make construction incredibly difficult even under normal circumstances. But the Japanese were at war, resources were limited, and time was running out. They needed this railway completed in just 18 months, a timeline that would have been aggressive even with modern equipment and willing workers. The victims. Now, here's where the story gets really dark. The Japanese forced people into slavery. The Japanese decided to use more than 60,000 Allied prisoners who had fallen into their hands in early 1942. These were British, Australian, Dutch, American, and Canadian troops who had been captured during the fall of Singapore and other military disasters found themselves facing a fate worse than death. The Japanese also rounded up hundreds of thousands of Asian civilians, people they called Ramusha. These were ordinary people from Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and other occupied territories who were promised good jobs and fair wages. Instead, they were forced into slave labor under conditions that would shock even the most hardened observers. 16,000 Allied troops and 1 LAC Asian laborers died during its construction. Think about those numbers for a moment. To put that in perspective, that's like wiping out the entire population of a medium-sized city. The Allied prisoners came from all walks of life. There were career soldiers with decades of experience. There were officers who had led men into battle and ordinary enlisted men who just wanted to do their duty and go home. Many of these prisoners had already endured months of brutal treatment in Japanese prison camps before being shipped off to work on the railway. They were already weakened by malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. The idea of forcing them to perform back-breaking labor in one of the most hostile environments on Earth was nothing short of a death sentence. The Asian civilian laborers faced an equally horrific fate. Many had been tricked into coming with promises of good wages and comfortable living conditions. Others were simply rounded up at gunpoint and forced onto trains heading for the construction sites. These people had no military training, no understanding of what they were getting into, and no hope of rescue. Hell on Earth. Imagine the worst working conditions you can think of. Now, multiply that by 1,000, and you're starting to understand what these people faced every single day. The construction of the death railway was systematic torture disguised as a building project. Workers were forced to toil for 16 to 18 hours a day in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. The humidity was so intense that many men couldn't catch their breath, and this was just the beginning of their suffering. While the Japanese had some mechanical equipment, the vast majority of work was done by hand. Men used simple picks, shovels and hammers to carve through solid rock and clear thousands of tons of jungle. They built bridges with nothing but wooden planks and rope. They moved massive boulders using only human strength and basic pulleys. The main causes of death were maltreatment, starvation, overwork, and disease. The food rations were deliberately kept at starvation levels. A typical daily meal consisted of a small bowl of rice with perhaps a few vegetables or a tiny piece of fish. This wasn't nearly enough nutrition for men performing heavy manual labor in extreme heat. Disease spread through the work camps like wildfire. Malaria, dysentery, cholera, and tropical ulcers were constant companions. Men would wake up in the morning to find their bunkmates had died during the night. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, and Japanese guards showed no mercy for workers who became too sick to continue. Guards would beat workers for the smallest infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all. Men were forced to watch their friends die and then continue working as if nothing had happened. The constant threat of violence hung over every moment of every day. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was the complete disregard for human life. The Japanese treated these workers as nothing more than disposable tools. When someone died, their body would be quickly disposed of and replaced with another worker. It was said that one man died for every railway sleeper laid along its 250-mile length. The monsoon seasons brought additional nightmare conditions. Workers were forced to continue laboring even during torrential downpours that turned construction sites into muddy swamps. Flash floods would wash away weeks of work in minutes, and workers would be beaten for not preventing the inevitable. The infamous Hellfire Pass. If the entire death railway was hell on Earth, then Hellfire Pass was the very depths of that hell. This section of the railway became legendary for its brutality and the sheer number of lives it claimed. The name itself tells you everything you need to know about how horrific this place was. Hellfire Pass was a massive cutting through solid rock in the Tenasserim Hills along the Thailand-Burma border. The Japanese needed to carve a passage through a mountain to keep the railway on schedule, and they were determined to do it regardless of the human cost. Workers were forced to break through 75 meters of solid rock using nothing but hand tools, dynamite, and human sweat. The work went on 24 hours a day, with shifts working by torchlight through the night. The flickering flames dancing across the rock walls and the constant sound of hammers striking stone created an image that witnesses described as looking like hell itself. The death toll at Hellfire Pass was staggering even by death railway standards. Men died from exhaustion, cave-ins, premature dynamite explosions, and simply from being worked to death. The Japanese guards showed absolutely no mercy, beating workers who couldn't keep up the impossible pace. Unlike other sections of the railway where death often came from disease or accidents, at Hellfire Pass, men knew they were being worked to death deliberately. The Japanese made no secret of their intention to push workers beyond human endurance. The psychological impact of working at Hellfire Pass was devastating. Survivors later described the constant sound of dying men crying out for help, the sight of bodies being carried away daily, and the knowledge that they might be next. Some men went insane from the stress and had to be restrained to prevent them from attacking the guards, a move that would have meant instant death. The irony of Hellfire Pass is that despite all the suffering and death, the section was ultimately abandoned after the war. The railway fell into disrepair, and nature began to reclaim what had cost so many lives to build. Today, visitors can walk through the cutting and see memorials to the men who died there, but the railway tracks themselves are long gone. Survival stories. In the midst of all this horror, there were incredible stories of human courage and survival that deserve to be told. These are real accounts from real people who lived through the unimaginable and somehow found the strength to keep going. One of the most remarkable aspects of life on the death railway was how prisoners and civilian workers found ways to help each other survive. Despite being starved, beaten, and worked to the point of collapse, many men shared their meager food rations with those who were sicker or weaker. They developed secret networks to share information, hide contraband medicine, and provide emotional support. Some prisoners used their professional skills to save lives in creative ways. Doctors performed surgery with improvised instruments. Engineers found ways to make construction tasks slightly less dangerous. Teachers organized secret schools to keep minds active and spirits up. These small acts of rebellion and humanity became lifelines in an ocean of brutality. Men would volunteer to take extra beatings to protect their comrades. They would steal food and medicine, knowing that capture meant torture or death. Some organized daring escape attempts, even though they knew the jungle was almost as deadly as the prison camps. Religious faith played a crucial role in many survival stories. Men from different faiths found strength in prayer, meditation, and shared spiritual practices. They held secret religious services and found ways to observe important holidays, even under impossible conditions. For many, their faith was the only thing that kept them sane. One of the most inspiring aspects of these survival stories is how men found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. They remembered birthdays, shared stories about their families, and made plans for what they would do after the war. These simple acts of hope became acts of resistance against their captors' attempts to break their spirits. Perhaps most remarkably, many survivors later spoke about how the experience, horrible as it was, taught them valuable lessons about the strength of human bonds and the importance of never giving up hope. The people behind the brutality. While it's easy to paint all Japanese guards as monsters, the reality of who these people were and why they acted so brutally is more complex and disturbing than simple evil. Understanding the perpetrators doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps us understand how ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary cruelty. Many of the guards were ordinary Japanese soldiers who had been shaped by a military culture that valued death before dishonor and viewed surrender as the ultimate shame. In Japanese military thinking at the time, anyone who surrendered had forfeited their right to be treated as human. This mindset made it psychologically easier for guards to justify the brutal treatment of prisoners. The Japanese military also operated under a system where officers routinely beat subordinates, and this violence flowed downhill through the ranks. Guards who were themselves victims of brutal treatment often took out their frustrations on the prisoners under their control. This cycle of violence created an atmosphere where cruelty became normalized. Some guards were Korean or Taiwanese conscripts who were fighting for an empire that considered them second-class citizens. These men often felt pressure to prove their loyalty by being especially harsh toward prisoners. They were caught between their own oppression and the opportunity to have power over others. There were also economic incentives for brutal treatment. The Japanese military was under enormous pressure to complete the railway quickly and cheaply. Guards who pushed their workers hardest and completed sections fastest were rewarded, while those who showed mercy were punished or reassigned. But perhaps most disturbing is that some guards seem to genuinely enjoy the power and cruelty. These individuals went beyond what was required and took pleasure in causing suffering. Post-war testimonies describe guards who would invent new forms of torture or who would beat prisoners for entertainment. At the end of World War II, 111 Japanese military officials were tried for war crimes for their brutality during the construction of the railway. 32 of them were sentenced to death. These trials revealed the systematic nature of the abuse and helped establish legal precedents for prosecuting war crimes. It's important to note that not all Japanese personnel were equally brutal. Some testimonies describe guards who would quietly provide extra food or medical supplies when possible. A few even warned prisoners about particularly dangerous work assignments. However, these acts of mercy were rare exceptions in a system designed to dehumanize and exploit. The race against time. The question many people ask is, why were the Japanese so determined to complete this railway that they were willing to sacrifice over 1,000 lives? The answer lies in understanding the strategic situation Japan faced in 1942 and 1943 and the growing desperation of its military position. By 1942, Japan had achieved stunning military successes across the Pacific, but they were also overextended and vulnerable. Their supply lines were stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, making them easy targets for Allied submarines and air attacks. The Burma campaign was crucial to their overall strategy, but supplying it by sea was becoming increasingly dangerous. The original plan was to complete the railway in 6 years using conventional construction methods. But as the war situation deteriorated for Japan, military planners became increasingly desperate. They shortened the timeline to just 18 months, a decision that essentially guaranteed massive casualties among the workers. Japanese military culture placed enormous emphasis on achieving impossible objectives through sheer willpower and sacrifice. This mindset trickled down to every level of the railway construction project. There was also a racist element to the Japanese decision-making. Military leaders genuinely believed that Asian and Western lives were expendable in the service of the Japanese Empire's greater goals. The Japanese were also under pressure from their German allies, who were counting on Japanese success in Southeast Asia to help divide Allied attention and resources. Completing the railway quickly was seen as essential to maintaining this crucial alliance. As the war progressed and Japan's position became more desperate, the pressure to complete the railway only intensified. By 1943, Japanese forces were losing battles across the Pacific, and the Burma Railway was seen as one of the last chances to achieve a strategic victory that might help negotiate a favorable peace. The irony is that even after all the suffering and death, the railway was never as strategically valuable as the Japanese had hoped. Allied air attacks made it dangerous to use, and by the time it was completed, Japan's overall military position was already deteriorating rapidly. The aftermath. Work began at both ends of the rail line in June 1942, and the railway was finally completed in October 1943. But the completion of the Death Railway was just the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. The Japanese had achieved their goal of connecting Thailand and Burma by rail, but at an almost unimaginable human cost. By the time the railway was completed in October 1943, at least 2,815 Australians, over 11,000 other Allied prisoners, and perhaps 75,000 Romusha were dead. Many of the surviving prisoners were kept in Southeast Asia to perform other forced labor projects. They built airfields, constructed fortifications, and worked in mines and factories. The same brutal conditions continued: inadequate food, no medical care, constant violence, and the ever-present threat of death. The civilian workers who survived faced perhaps an even worse fate. Many had no way to return to their home countries and were left stranded in foreign lands with no money, no documentation, and no support. Families back home often never learned what had happened to their loved ones. As the war turned against Japan, conditions for prisoners actually got worse. Guards became more violent and unpredictable as they faced the prospect of defeat. Food became even scarcer as Japanese supply lines collapsed. Many prisoners who had survived the construction of the railway died in the final months of the war. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the surviving prisoners were in terrible condition. Many were suffering from multiple diseases and injuries. The psychological trauma was just as severe. Many men had been broken mentally by years of systematic abuse and torture. The liberation of the prison camps was a complex process. Many prisoners were in such remote locations that it took weeks or months for Allied forces to reach them. Some guards fled, leaving prisoners to fend for themselves in hostile jungle environments. Others surrendered peacefully, while some fought to the end. The immediate aftermath of liberation was chaotic and often disappointing for survivors. Medical care was limited, transportation home was slow and difficult, and many men found that their families and communities had given up hope and moved on. The process of rebuilding their lives would take years or even decades. The Burma Railway, known as the Death Railway, was one of the deadliest construction projects in history, built by the Japanese during World War II using forced labor from Allied prisoners and Asian civilians. In just 18 months, over 1 Lhasa lives were lost constructing the 415-kilometer line through hostile jungle terrain, roughly 1 death for every railway sleeper laid. The reality was one of unimaginable cruelty, back-breaking labor, and staggering loss of life, contrasted only by the resilience and solidarity shown by many prisoners. Today, memorials and museums in Thailand and Burma preserve the memory of this tragedy, reminding us of the dangers of dehumanization, the value of human dignity, and the need to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Which part of the Death Railway story shocked you most? The cruelty, the death toll, or the resilience that refused to break? Comment down below.